Detailed instructions were offered as to what should be loaded on board. He tells you, whatever I have laded upon the earth, the ship, whatever of silver I've laded upon her, and gold I've laded upon her, what I had of all the living beings I had laid upon her, all of my family and kin, I made go aboard the ship, the beasts of the field, the wild creatures of the field, and the craftsmen I had made go aboard. Well, is that two of everything? Oh, hell no. That would take a few aircraft carriers, and then you'd have to have a few aircraft carriers worth of food that would somehow make it. So you wouldn't be taking two of everything, because if these guys eat rabbits, and how many rabbits they go through? Man. And we got to keep those rabbits alive by feeding them food until they get eaten. This whole problem of logistics comes into play, but I'm not going to go there with the Noah story situation and how you could pick that apart with the animals and how you'd put the polar bears back in situations like that. But here we get a tale. For then came the storm, Adad. This is Baal Hadad. This is Zeus. This is the storm god. Adad thundered. Nergal tore down the doorpost of the gates that held back the waters of the upper ocean. The Anunnaki lifted up their torches, setting the land ablaze. And so, what's weird is, fire and water don't mix. But here's a tale of before the flood hit, that apparently the Anunnaki gods had lifted up their torches, setting the land ablaze, and burning off quite a bit of the sacred forests, Humbaba, and situations like this. And a lot of people nowadays, including myself, relate this to perhaps the Younger Dryas event, where it would have been an instant scorching of lands or something, or maybe even a smaller event that's not recorded that happened up in the mountains north of these people in Sumeria, that melted off all the snow at one point, and it let loose, busting loose a somewhat natural dam that was holding back a little lake-ish type area that just let loose and flooded out the whole area. Fire and water don't mix, so it's strange that they set ablaze with their glare. Now this supposedly is them glaring at the land too, and then that is kind of telling in itself. And oh damn, we went on to part 2. I'm sorry. I was trying to quit it right there. About 3 minutes early. So what we missed there was that Nergal had let loose these floodgates, and in doing so, the earth was set ablaze, and in doing so, it set forth the flood. So not only did spring take and melt the firmament that would have been on top of all the mountains over here that they can see, but even north of that, which leads into the rivers that lead into the Tigris and Euphrates, and so couldn't handle it upstream and came downstream, backed up, and as soon as it did, it became their flood story. But as I indicated too, this had probably happened at the Younger Dryas event, for we know Inanna's lament, and the one they talk about here is the thing that happens later. So if God said he wasn't going to do it again, and it happened again, then that would have been the gods had left us, or God's too pissed off at us again, or whatever. And in this we find the tale of Abraham, where it tells you that Abraham and Jacob had gone across the river to the west and started worshiping the different gods. Get a drink here. So what's strange about that is that tells you that the gods of creation would have been somebody different than Abraham ends up worshiping. Says it right there. Kind of turns around and says they must be false gods because they either lied or they didn't know or the crap happened again, right? Whenever he said it wasn't going to. Often when I think about this, I wonder if it happened again, just like they said, and some asteroid hit and it caused some type of flood event that everybody would equate to it again, because God said in the Bible that we have right now that it would never happen again. If it happened again, would they go, well, he lied, and what would that cause? For people seem to be sitting around and waiting for it. So they set the land ablaze with their glare. The gods succeeded in terrifying even themselves in the tale, it says, and they cowered like dogs against the wall of heaven. But then Ishtar relented, and she lifted up her voice and bewailed her action, while the rest of the gods wept with her. And in the tale, it's strange, for it doesn't actually say it right here, I don't think. It may say it a little bit later, for I ended about here and decided I would start talking about it. That she wished that they had never brought the flood upon the people, and look at what we're doing. No, 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 this is wrong. And they vowed to never do it again. This is where you get it in the Bible, the same concept. And did they tell them and show them a rainbow after they came back down? Well, in this last time, no, because they were all damn dead. They were gone or moving on, not in the land anymore. They couldn't be. The famine that hit afterwards for the flood caused them to leave, and they themselves became a flood upon other lands, like they had before. Hot ding. For it looks like if you go with that idea, then the promised land was Eden at one time. No, it wasn't the starting point, it was the ending point. It was the culmination of what all they had done, and they built this great land and had it all going so kick-ass, and then they, due to their own little cocky ways, if you will, and too much revelry and too much blah blah blah, it got all taken away from them. Right? Think about that. But it's just blamed on us, or blamed on God, as opposed to now, once we get to the point of reality of seeing what happens when things like this happen, like the tsunami, in situations that could have easily turned into an ancient mythology long ago. But her voice bewailed her action, and the rest of the gods wept with her. The storm raged for 6 days and nights. On the seventh day, the gods rested. And this is where we get that from, as opposed to, and creation, and that exact number, as opposed to the 40 days and 40 nights situation. On the seventh day it subsided, and Utnapishtim looked out and saw that all human life had returned to clay. The flood myth of Genesis differed from this tale only in minor details. For example, the storm lasts for 40 days rather than 7, and 40 days and 40 nights and 40 years and a generation, and all this situation. A generation was gone. This was a simple way to take and put that against it, right? And also numerology sets it with the sun, right? Also in this tale, Utnapishtim is called Noah. There's one other difference worth noting. The Babylonian deity who inaugurates the deluge is female, while the god of Genesis is male. Now, that's strange that they tell it that way, but yes, she does help to inaugurate it in one version of the tale, but in the other one, it's Enlil that is going crazy, and then she kind of goes with him, and perhaps in a bad mood one day, While the God of Genesis is male, although Ishtar in the Babylonian story and Yahweh in the Hebrew promise faithfully never to inflict such a doom upon mankind again, this promise is understandably viewed with some suspicion. From a psychological perspective, the terror of the flood still lives in the hearts of those who are Neptune bound, and in the dreams of apocalypse, millennium, and judgment day, it may even be a hoped for event. And you can see people in a current modern time kind of starting to feel like that they hope for this type of event. Some of them are feeling that they've been oppressed whenever they're in the best situation that they've ever been in their whole histories, which is strange and odd. But if the media gets behind it, they can make you, if you're weak-minded, think all kinds of things. And back in these days, it were priests and town criers in situations that would call out the news of the day. They would bring about the news of something bad happening. But in the smaller villages, everything was pretty much known in that village. But then the other news would come to you, sweeping across the plain. People look at this idea of this Neptune-bound situation. What does that mean? Well, there was a people that were relying on the rivers to help spread humanity everywhere they went. Kind of like everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. Well, ding. And they utilized water and boats and rivers and things. And you can imagine a people would be steeped in a river god and water god lore. And something we'd see is like the Phoenicians, or people called themselves Canaanites, if you will, that had this going on. But Babylonians had seaworthy boats. So did the Egyptians. So did many cultures. In fact, I've shown just recently how boats go back many, many thousands of years. The idea of knowing about going around a smooth earth too predates the idea of thinking you were going to fall off the earth in Columbus. And though you might have an idea that people eventually by then in the Dark Ages had gotten driven to an idea and forgotten things from elder times, we've seen now that during that middle time the Vikings were making trips over here and so on. And it looks like we have Phoenician type evidence also, and a few others. Not only in that, but in the folklore that we find in the actual South Americans and Indians themselves, talking about tall, white, red-headed people, or the children of the gods that were blonde, and the Wari people who had blue eyes, and the blue-eyed mummies that you can still find, and the wonders of X haplogroup, which shows up around Anatolia in Western Europe, but also is shown in the Amerindian tribes of the northeastern United States. The Egyptians, too, had their myth of retributive destruction of humanity. The sun god Ra sent his emissary, the cow goddess Hathor, to slaughter all living beings. Here, as in Babylon, the actual destroyer is the primary female creatrix. But we also find out the women have this flood of creation situation too, don't we? And if we look in the Egyptians, we can see the goddess Nut as the Milky Way, controlling all of this. And her seeding of life, and this Milky Way, and why we call it that, is supposed to be that somehow in a way her breast milk is feeding the cosmos, and we're just one of the lucky stars that the gods had brought into being. Later we find out we're not even a star, that's just a sun going around, and we're a planet that's revolving around that. Right. But the planets are wandering stars, aren't they? So where does this idea of heaven being full of water and God letting in these storm clouds that let loose the floodgates comes from? Well, it looks like a misunderstanding of the original idea in my eyes, that the firmament that let loose was all of the ice turning to water, and we nowadays look at that and go, yeah, okay, but it got turned into something else where God had vents in heaven. There's a firmament over the earth. It's like we're living in a snow globe, and it's got vents in it. Not there's water in the snow globe, but everywhere out of it is inside of there. Inside, we're living inside a spit bubble floating on water inside a piece of cork. Yeah, and all God has to do is kind of push that down a little bit, and we all go underwater. And the firmament below would have been the well waters coming up and getting full. And I talked about in the other videos how that is a reality. Whenever it floods, it does fill up with everything, so a well is no longer what it was before, and it ruins the well water. You know, eventually it can settle out and purge itself somewhat, but a lot of wells go bad and things like that, and it just ruins the whole land somewhat. Man, if you had it inundated by salt water, it would definitely ruin it worse. But so Hathor and Ra in some of the earliest creatrix type things. There's also the goddess of the lion of the desert, and she comes and brings heat as a scorching heat and kills things off, and that's a different way. But Ra relented and devised a plan for making 7,000 jars of barley beer. He dyed them with red ochre to resemble blood. This was poured out on the fields to a depth of 9 inches. When Hathor saw this bloody shining in the dawn, reflecting her own face in its beauty, she was enchanted and began to drink, and eventually she became drunk and forgot her rage against humanity. What's weird about that tale is red ochre is an iron oxide, and it actually works somewhat as a fertilizer, but also blood is high in nitrogen and iron that's in it too, and things, and it can act as a fertilizer with the soil. And there are ancient tales of how the Red Sea turned red, or the Nile, like in the Moses tale when he strikes his stripe and it turns all red. But people used to do this ritual where they would put red ochre or red dye in the water every year, and during certain festivals they would dyeing all their fabrics in red somewhat, and the pour off of that into the water turned it somewhat red. There's other people say, well, cyanobacteria can bloom and it'll turn red, and all these things could make it be the plagues and everything, but there is that fact with that also, and this fact. But it's a little different there, for they live off a river culture that doesn't rely on the rain, so they don't have the storm god necessarily, but they do have Hadad, Baal Hadad, known well and adopted somewhat in their cultures, Ammon, Saturn, from all the Canaanites that are around there too. So it's not like the Egyptians are immune to this adoptive situation that happened with the Greeks and all these others. And I mentioned before, the Greek gods weren't gods from some little mountain right up here, but they were the gods of the earth, and the Greeks embraced them as such. But they got the cow drunk, and she forgot her rage against humanity. The Greeks inevitably had their flood as well, sent by an angry Zeus to annihilate the human race. So in this turn, it's a storm god. But in this version of the myth, Zeus's fury at the impious deeds of the sons of Lycaon, who murdered their brother Nicodemus and cooked him into a soup. And this is very much like the idea of Cain and Abel. And wouldn't it be a strange story if you were to read, well, Cain and Abel gave their sacrifices. God liked his better. He got pissed off. He killed his brother and tried to feed him to God, or sacrificed him to God. But the best known version of the Greek flood is linked to the sin of Prometheus, as a result of which Zeus' destruction was unleashed to punish the theft of sacred fire. Apparently, Pandora's box was insufficient. The Greek flood hero was called Deucalion. He was the son of Prometheus and was warned by his father as Ea warned Utnapishtim to build an ark. Deucalion filled it with victuals and climbed aboard with his wife Pyrrha, which is very much like pyramid. When the south wind blew, the rain fell, and the rivers, rising with astonishing speed, roared down to the sea and washed away every city of the coast and plains. The entire world was submerged, and all mortal creatures, save Deucalion with Pyrrha, were lost. And when I tell you the Greeks had their hand in that, and the idea of Levitical priest, where that comes from for Leviathan, Levi, what's a Levi? It's the pointy witch cap that the Levitical priests used to wear that we would think of nowadays as being somewhat of like a Merlin look. Potting. Perhaps the strangest myth of the flood comes from the Indian Mahabharata. Here's the story of Manu, a kind of Hindu Noah. One day while Manu sat in the forest, a fish arose from a stream and asked for his protection against a bigger fish which desired to eat him, swallow it. Manu duly placed the fish in an earthen jar and tended it carefully until it became very large. The fish pleaded to be transferred to the Ganges River, but when they reached the river, the fish then declared that it was too big even for the holy river, and begged to be taken to the ocean. Manu obeyed and released it into the sea, whereupon the fish told him that the dissolution of the universe was at hand, according to the turn of the great cosmic cycle. A strange, correlation I have to do with fish. I kept fish in aquariums quite a lot through this, and saltwater aquariums especially, and became a specialist somewhat in it, but that's for many other videos. But the comet goldfish that people commonly know, the carp goldfish, you can keep one for years and years and you might get 6 or 8 inches, but there's an entire possibility. Fish have a non-terminal growth phase. They can grow throughout their life. And somebody kept a fish in England for over 52 years inside of a bowl. And in the story here, it's basically he kept the thing for a large portion of his life. And he kept daily going and dipping into the river and giving it brand new water and feeding it in situations like this, and can get it to live. And could it live 50 years? But it's not common for all goldfish to live that long, but it's incredibly possible. Manu obeyed him, though, and released it into the sea, whereupon the fish told him that the dissolution of the universe was at hand. According to the turn of the great cosmic cycle, Manu is instructed to build a massive ark and take with him the different seeds enumerated by Brahmins in days of yore. And this has to do with the Aryans. And the fish promised to appear out of the waters as a horned sea beast to aid him during the terrible deluge which was at hand. Now, if we look in the ancient topographical maps, you'll find something that looks like a goldfish with horns on it. And a lot of people have said, oh, that's got to be a misinterpretation of whales. And I'll agree with that. But it also shows you a connection to this, because quite often they're horned, and whales aren't horned. A narwhal has a horn on it. That's a unicorn, and that's for a different video. But the idea here that he turned into a whale, a saltwater creature, he grew that fish so big, and these things, it's a fishtail. Well, let's continue. So Manu did as he was told and set up the ark on the sea. Then the fish rose up, and Manu tied a rope to its horns. The sea flooded the land, and there was water everywhere. Even the heaven and the firmament dissolved. Manu floated on the waters for many long years. And when a new universe was created, the fish towed him to the highest peak of the Hamavak, like the Himalayas. Then the fish revealed itself as Brahma and blessed Manu, giving him the gift of creating a new mankind. And this is kind of like a Prometheus type situation too, and being able to create man, and quite often they're made out of clay. or return to clay, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, or clay, clay. Always when I think about that, I think of Clash of the Titans, the old movie of it, where Perseus is trodden down and washed ashore and ruined and isn't going to be able to do what he's supposed to do. And Zeus just takes that little clay statue of him and sets it back up and then kind of looks around like, and walks off. And then you see Perseus back up and going. And so, how the gods, like a chess piece, influence mankind. There are other flood myths, just as there are other myths of creation. These few give us a clear portrayal of the fate of which awaits corrupt humanity if the gods become angry enough. What then are we confronting in these fearful images of heavenly punishment? Implicit in the mythology of the flood is an inherent sense of sin and the terror of annihilation by an enraged parent deity. The word sin comes from the Latin sans, which means guilty. The word guilt, in turn, comes from the Anglo-Saxon gildan, which means to requite or pay a debt, and also the idea of a gelding, that being a castrated horse, much like a steer, is seen in that same way, and it sure paid a debt. Sin and guilt are concerned with a debt owed to the Creator, the debt of life itself, which requires obedience and sacrifice to pay off that debt. I do not need to elaborate here on the psychological implications of this debt when the archetypical image of the divine Creator is confused with the personal experience of a mother who bears us. And if we think of that concept and the mothering situation, and you think of an early child, and whenever they're with their mother, they see the face of God, for she is the Creator, and it rolls generation after generation like a big wheel. Any evidence of an independent individuality might invoke a terrible punishment, though. I have met this deep but inexplicable fear in many people in whom Neptune is strong. The fear that if one dares to be happy and fulfilled through an illicit or disobedient path in life, somehow everything's going to go horribly wrong. The flood will come, and one will be destroyed. Sinful creatures that we are, guilty of a primal and unforgivable reneging of our debt of life, driven out of our original paradisical home, we are perpetually in danger of sinking even more deeply into corruption, at which point a final vengeance will be inflicted which wipes out the offending life form utterly and paves the way for a new cosmos, a new Eden, and a new humanity. And sometimes people look at the world and how corrupt it's gotten and overpopulated and would like something like that to happen, but it's got to be special and only take out these people or those people somehow, right? You'll find in the Bible every time that situations like this happen, in reality, that it actually is man doing these things. In fact, in the Bible, if you look, he couldn't seem to do the thing that he needed to do or turn that area of the desert they were in into a better land than Canaan somehow by just making a river and a few mountains, and then it too had its own floodplain right in the middle of that. Hell, he could have made the world's first water park and all kinds of things and made it into a Disneyland, but none of that did happen, did it? There's always a survivor, a freer of sin than most, and there's always a Father God who warns the chosen one to build a ship. Whether we interpret this as life-saving intervention on part of a male deity as an image of the protective role of the father in infancy, ding, or as an image of some protective spirit within oneself, a ding, it is an integral part of the flood myth. People having these ideals. There's a psychological thing I'd like to do a video on. It's interesting to me somewhat, but it's an hour and a half dissertation on how the psychological aspects of the Bible, although now looking back at them, are quite barbaric, did in a way help at least keep people on tree branches, if you will, that all interconnected to the point that led us to the modern day. I think that's the reason we still grasp upon it, is like, well, look at how badass we are and we're spacemen, and we've been doing that, and great grandpa had a Bible, so yeah, well, great grandpa's wife got burned as a witch because she knew how to heal people, and she had a cat after he died. We can begin to get a sense of how to approach Neptune when we contemplate this mysterious inner spiritual protector who is himself, like Enki or Ea, the progeny of the original sea. For the ark is a kind of ego container, a sealed vessel made of wood and pitch. It is in effect the alembic of the body ego, painstakingly crafted through ordinary human effort, humble and earthly, but tough enough to withstand the fury of the primal waters. And as all of Neptune is within us, the primal source, protective father god, elected survivor, and the great emotional inundation of the flood, so too is the ark, which betrays our capacity to float on the waters, yet remain dry, separate and contained until the deluge inevitably abates and leaves us alone. In a cleansed world, the ark is an image of neither the repression, for it rides the waves rather than attempting to dam them, nor of drowning, for it remains safely above the waters. It is a paradox, and we will see much more of it later. It is not surprising that though there's a great terror implicit in the mythical threat of the flood, there's also a great longing. Perhaps it might be better off after all. Perhaps we deserve it. At least the guilt and the suffering and the loneliness and the separation from the source will cease. Well, people think that now, but if you think about the suffering and the things that will happen for generation after generation after generation, if it doesn't happen in some special little poof way, then you realize that none of this is something that you should be longing for in any situation. I can understand depression, believe me. I can understand depression, but I can also understand how it and some instinctual type desires and the belief that maybe everything goes away whenever you go away makes people want to have that desire. This fear of death and a death wish at the same time, and this special Neptunian kind of ambivalence towards death, is directly linked with the sense of sin and fleshly corruption which separation breeds. Adam and Eve, having sinned once, all humanity is infected with their stain, and downhill spiral follows, which can only be circumvented by strenuous individual sacrifice and expiation, or by the advent of a redeemer, or by a grand collective purging what gets rid of everybody once and for all. We deal with the theme of the Redeemer in the next chapter and with the theme of an individual expiation later on, but it's now appropriate to explore the manner in which the fear of the flood becomes the hope of the apocalypse to happen, welcomed because, despite the violence of its imagery and its promises, for the faithful at least, a return to that walled garden of delight wherein flow the waters of eternal life. And I could see how, and can't you see now, how a religious type directive can really drive people to do odd things, and which wish the worst of all on humanity and themselves sometimes. And I know this video took a little bit of a left turn, but it's really off the words of the author, and I'm merely reflecting it because I'm rubber and you're glue, bounce off me, stick to you. we can see how the instinct of humans that are attached to water and their fear of floods, whenever used in a religious context, could be driven as an overall concept, like this idea of original sin and so on, that begin used against oneself in some way, and their ability to want there to be a great beyond, that it should go farther, stronger, higher. We should be Star Trek. We should go past that, and we haven't even come up with what that is yet. Anyhow, guys, that's going to do it, because she's going on to a next chapter and a next thought line, and if I do the same thing here, we're going to go to third and fourth and fifth chapters of it. If you'd like to go farther with this and its tales, let me know, and I'll continue the series here. Like, share, and subscribe, and enjoy. Peace.